A few years back, I decided to hold a yard sale. My garage was overflowing with junk, old furniture, boxes of books, clothes that didn't fit anymore. So I just figured it was time to clear out some space and maybe make a little money while I was at it. And by 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, my driveway was packed with tables covered in stuff that I thought that I might sell. Neighbors came and went, poking around, asking prices. Some haggled, some just handed over crumpled bills, but for the most part, they smiled politely and made a little small talk and then moved on. And by mid-morning, strangers were starting to notice the sale as they were walking or driving by. And then the more people gathered, the more people noticed the sale, so by maybe 11 to 11:30, I was getting quite a lot of foot traffic and making quite a few sales. And at one point, I noticed a man lingering by a table of tools, picking up a wrench and then a hammer and turning them over in his hands like he was deciding one or another. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, jeans, and a Dodgers cap. Nothing very unusual about him, but something about the way his eyes darted around that made me very uneasy. On the assumption that he was looking around for the person running the sale, I walked over and introduced myself. The guy then said he was interested in the tools and then asked if I had any more, but his voice was sort of flat, like he was reading from a script but very badly. I pointed to a box of odds and ends near the back of the driveway and he nodded and then walked over slowly. By noon, it was just a trickle of people wandering in and out. I was very tired and ready to pack it in, and that's when I noticed the man in the Dodgers cap again, meaning he'd been hanging around for almost an hour without buying anything. He was hanging around the edge of the driveway, pacing past the tables like he hadn't already seen everything 3 times over. But then, he wasn't looking at the stuff anymore. He seemed like he was looking at me. I tried to ignore him, announced that I was about to pack up, and then focused on the last few shoppers. A woman asked about a lamp, a teenager bought a stack of DVDs, but the whole time I kept an eye on the man in the Dodgers cap, all while trying my best to pretend that I wasn't. When the driveway was finally empty except for him, I started packing up. I told him the sale was over, that I needed to get everything back inside. He didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me, his hands shoved into his pockets. I started to get a little nervous, but told myself that he was obviously harmless, just a little odd, and that I was anxious. I loaded a couple of boxes in the garage, keeping one eye on him, but when I turned back, he had moved closer. He was standing in the middle of the driveway by that point, looking down at one of the tables, and he said something about the tools again, but his tone made it sound like he wasn't really asking. I told him that they weren't for sale anymore, that I was done for the day. He nodded, but he didn't leave. Instead, he reached down and picked up a hammer, turning it over in his hands again. And in that moment, my throat went dry. I told him to put it down, to leave, but he just stared at me, like he was thinking, making up his mind. I don't know what set him off, though. Maybe it was the way that I said it, or maybe he had been planning this all along. One second, he was standing there, and the next, he was moving towards me, and fast. I backed up, my feet stumbling over the edge of the driveway. He raised the hammer, and I turned to run. I barely made it to the garage before he grabbed me, his fingers digging into my arm. I twisted away, yanking free, but then tripped over a box. I think it was, of books. It was right behind me, looming over me as I scrambled backward, searching for anything that I could grab. My hand closed around something solid and heavy, a wrench from the box that he had looked through earlier. I swung it without thinking, the metal connecting with a very sickening thud, and he stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and rage, and I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I scrambled to my feet and ran, bolting through the side door into the house. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and then pressed my back against the door, listening for any sound outside. It was quiet for a moment, and then I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel moving away. I crept to the window, peeking out through the blinds. He was gone. The driveway was empty, the yard sale tables scattered with what was left of my things. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened, and to my relief they arrived quicker than I thought they would. I showed them where it had happened, pointed to the hammer that he had dropped and the wrench still lying on the garage floor. They took my statement, asking questions I could barely answer, and they never found him. The man who had turned a quiet yard sale into a nightmare disappeared as quickly as he had come. And weeks passed, and I kept expecting him to show up again, to finish what he had started. And every time I heard a car pull into the driveway or a knock at the door, my heart leapt in my throat. I stopped holding yard sales, and I stopped leaving the garage door open even for a second. I watched for strangers more closely, my mind replaying the way his eyes had lingered on me, the way his hand had tightened around that hammer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there and that one day he might return. The police told me to stay vigilant, to report anything suspicious, but there was nothing to report, just an empty driveway and the memory of his shadow stretching across the pavement. The stuff I hadn't sold that day stayed in the garage, just gathering dust, I guess, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it, to move it, or to go near the spot where it had happened. Now, it might sound pathetic, but some nights I dream about him. I see him standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on me. And then I wake up, drenched in sweat. The yard sale was supposed to be a simple way to clear out the clutter, to make some extra cash, and instead, it left me with a story to send to you that I'll never forget. A scar that's invisible, but is always there. I don't know if they'll ever catch him, or if he's still out there looking for his next target. All I know is that I'll never feel safe, truly safe, in my own home again. One morning, a few months ago during the summer, I decided to check out the yard sale down the street. Yard sales have always really interested me because you never know what kinds of treasures you might stumble across. And that morning, there was a nice crowd already picking through the tables as I walked up. Then I spotted an old lawn chair that looked just like the one my grandma used to have, so I made my way over to take a closer look. As I was giving the chair that closer look, I heard raised voices not too far away. It was coming from a lady who was standing by a table full of dishes and kitchen gadgets. She wasn't yelling or anything, but you could tell that there was some kind of disagreement happening. The lady was arguing with an older man who looked to be in his late 60s over a set of china plates that were all nicely arranged in a cardboard box, probably hoping to sell as a set. The woman was pointing at the plates and saying something I couldn't quite make out. Neither of them were hosting the sale either. Both were people from the neighborhood who'd come looking for a deal. I didn't think much of it at first, because as surprising as it sounds, some people can get pretty heated at yard sales. It's like they forget that they're just trying to get rid of junk that they don't need anymore, and some people take it very personally if you imply that something isn't as valuable as they think it is. And then occasionally, you get two potential buyers arguing over an item they both want, which appeared to be what was happening here. At first, it was just the lady getting very confrontational, but then the older man started raising his voice too, and the whole scene got more intense. He was pointing back at her, and they were exchanging words I couldn't really understand because they were both talking over each other about a mile a minute. I was still looking at that chair at first, not looking, but listening in. But then, by the time they started actually yelling at each other, my curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't help but glance over at the argument. Other people were turning to look too. One guy even set down the book that he was flipping through to see what was going on. Then the next thing, the host of the yard sale is walking over saying something like, Hey, take it easy." But then, before the guy can even get over there, the lady grabs one of the plates and raises it up above her head. I thought for sure that she was about to smash that plate or something, like a sort of, if I can't have it, no one can kind of deal. But the second she did, the older man lunges toward her, and because he's a little taller than her, grabs the plate with ease, but then starts trying to wrestle it out of her grip. The lady has one hand on the plate, another on her purse, but then the older guy puts two hands on the plate, and then sort of turns his body as he's pulling it out of her hands. He succeeds in pulling it out of her grip, but as he does, he loses his balance and falls. He hit the ground, and we heard the plate smash, and then the guy let out this very long and painful grunt, and just from the way it sounded, I knew that it was probably bad. And everyone seemed stunned. They all heard the same thing I did, and they must have known that something was bad too. But there was just this moment where no one moved and no one said anything, almost like we were hoping that things wouldn't be as bad as they looked. The woman froze, staring down at the man who lay on his front, not moving, and seconds later, we saw this blood start to ooze from underneath him, and the woman started screaming. People rushed to the older guy's aid, telling him not to move and yelling for someone to call 911. But the lady that had been in the scuffle with him just stood there, completely in shock, saying, oh my God, over and over. The folks that rushed over to help rolled the guy over so they could try and stop the bleeding, but that's when everyone saw the big shard of porcelain sticking out of the guy's stomach. The lady who had been in the scuffle started to cry as we did everything we could to stop the bleeding, and the man just sort of laid there, breathing heavily, his eyes wide open. Thankfully, the paramedics arrived fast, closely followed by the cops. Then, after the ambulance took the older guy off, the cops started taking statements from us. I didn't have much to say. I was just there to buy a lawn chair and not get involved in a yard sale showdown that ended up in someone dying. And the lady involved in the scuffle just cried and cried. And I don't think it was entirely her fault that the guy had fallen. Like it was all just a horrible accident, I suppose. But at the time, she clearly blamed herself for what had happened, and some people in the crowd did too. I think the cops then drove her home to talk to her more at her house. And later, as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the image of that man lying on the ground. It was the way that he was staring up at the sky, very wide-eyed and scared, more scared than I'd ever seen anyone in my whole life, and I can't imagine what must have been going through his head. And neither can I imagine what was going through the lady's head when she found out that the guy had actually passed. I found out from my neighbor the next day, and when I told him I was actually there, he asked me what had happened. And I told him that they were both being just childish, fighting over a piece of porcelain. And my neighbor then asked if the lady pushed the guy, and I said no, that he fell because he was sort of wrenching the plate away from the lady so hard that he spun around when it left her hands. I said that it seemed like the lady started it, but then again, I only heard her voice first, you know. The older man could have easily said something under his breath, and that's what started the whole thing. The whole thing felt like equal blame on each side, but in the end, it was a life lost and a life ruined. Really, neither of them deserved that. I guess once they got the full story, the older guy's family didn't press any charges, but the lady still left town not long after, I'm pretty sure. Even though it was all but publicly declared that she wasn't to blame, people still said that she killed that guy. It was like they wanted it to be her fault, just so they had someone to blame. And they didn't exactly go driving her out of town afterwards, but I guess all their stares and hushed words got too much for her, and she eventually moved on of her own accord. To me, it's just crazy how something as simple as an argument in a yard sale can end up in such tragedy. One second it's a nice day, people were out taking walks, and then the next, a dude's dead. It was a typical Saturday morning, filled with the usual errands and a long list of things to do. But the yard sale today's sign caught my eye as it drove past, and before I knew it, I found myself pulling over. It was set up in the front yard of a small, weathered house. Nothing really special, just the typical kind of yard sale that you see around here. But as I walked up, I noticed an old, unlabeled cardboard box sitting on the ground near the back of the table. It was dusty and looked like it hadn't been moved in years, and I crouched down and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't very heavy, but it was strangely solid, like there was a lot of stuff inside it. The lid was taped down and the edges were frayed. I asked what was inside, and the middle-aged man running the sale told me, "Just a box of old stuff. Feel free to take a look." I lifted the lid, carefully peeling away the tape, and then peered inside. The contents were a strange mix of items. There were a few old hairbands, a couple of rusted keys, a small hairbrush, and some photographs. But the one thing that stood out were all the newspaper clippings. They were all yellowed with age and crinkled along the edges, and I picked one up and read the headline, and when I did, I sort of felt a chill run down my spine. "Missing person, Jane Doe," it said. There were several clippings, all about the same person, a woman whose body had been found decades ago in a nearby town. I flipped through the articles, reading the details. Her body had been found in the early 90s, and partly because she was never identified, her murder went unsolved. The articles described Jane Doe as a young brunette, last seen visiting a local diner, but as I sifted through the clippings, I discovered more disturbing details. There were photographs tucked in among them, grainy, black and white images of a woman who matched Jane Doe's, walking alone in a parking lot, entering a store, or sitting on a bench. There were also personal items in the box. The hairbrush that I mentioned, a few pieces of jewelry, and some clothing. They were old, worn, and had a very musty smell. The seller was still standing behind the table, not really looking at me, and wasn't really saying a word. I glanced up at him, wondering if he knew anything about this Jane Doe, but he just stood there, silent and very indifferent. It was as if though he was waiting for me to leave so he could go back inside the house. I asked if he knew who the woman was, and he looked at it and just sort of shrugged. He said he found the box in his attic, had never opened it, and had no idea what was inside. But his answer didn't really sit right with me. How could he not care about what was inside that box? It wasn't just old stuff, it was part of someone's life, and it was somehow connected to some terrible unsolved murder. I wanted to press him for more information, but there was something about him that told me he wasn't interested in talking, and so I began reading the newspaper clipping more carefully. There were mentions of a man, Jane's boyfriend at the time that she went missing. He was a local guy, well known in town, but no one had seen him since the day that he disappeared. His name was mentioned in the articles, but there were no photos of him. As I pieced together the story, I began to wonder if the seller knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he was connected to the case somehow. Maybe he was hiding something. Could he have been involved in this Jane's disappearance, or was he telling the truth about just finding it in his home? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than I was seeing. I had to know more, but I didn't know where to start. The newspaper clippings were a dead end. They were decades old, and the people mentioned in them were long gone, so I decided to take the box with me. I paid that seller a few dollars for it and walked back to my car and then drove back home. When I got home, I laid all the clippings on my kitchen table in this sort of jumbled mess of information, and I tried to make sense of it all, but it was sort of like piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces, and the whole situation was very unsettling, and every clipping seemed to only raise more questions than they had answered. When my husband eventually arrived home, I showed him what I brought home from the yard sale, and at first he looked at me like I was nuts. But after he read through some of the clippings and took a look at the other more personal items, he started to see what I did. Anyone with photographs of Jane Doe would have surely known her identity, in which case, why didn't they come forward when they learned of her murder? I remember my husband said how, logically speaking, the photos and the clippings might not be connected. Someone might have just put a bunch of stuff in a box and without once stopping to consider how it might be interpreted when opened by complete strangers. And why the hell would they? But I doubted that very, very much. That seemed like way too much of a coincidence. If there was a bunch of old lottery tickets and a sewing kit in there, then yeah, maybe it was just a junk box. But everything was too personal, too deliberate. It almost felt like a trophy. My husband didn't want to believe it at first, saying I was just overreacting after getting in my own head about it, but I told him I was convinced. That wasn't just some random brunette lady. It was the murdered woman. It was Jane Doe. He didn't tell me when it clicked for him, but when I reached for the box, he almost snapped at me when he said, "Don't touch it." And that's when I knew that he believed it too. He didn't want me to touch anymore because he realized that it might actually be forensic evidence, something which, in my excitement, I hadn't considered at all up until that point. We got in touch with the police the next morning. They came and took the box, and then as far as I know, they went to talk to the guy that had hosted the yard sale about how exactly he'd come to own it. I called one of the officers that we spoke to a while later, and he said that the box and everything in it had been entered into Jane Doe's evidence file, and while it hadn't exactly blown open the case, it was certainly a development in what had been a decades-old unsolved murder. That was just about the only half-decent thing about this whole story. That somehow, and even if it was only a little, I actually helped. I still think about Liz, sometimes every day. She loved gardening, and her yard always looked neat, and I would wave to her on Saturday mornings when she was working on her flowers, and she was always smiling. This happened on January 25th, 2019, and that Friday morning was very cold for Houston. I was making coffee when I heard 4 loud pops. I thought it was fireworks at first, but something felt wrong. I looked out the window and saw someone running away from Liz's driveway and getting into a truck, and then the truck sped off. I went outside with my phone ready to call 911, and Liz was there lying on the ground near her driveway, and she wasn't moving. There was a small table and some boxes nearby from the garage sale that she was setting up. Neighbors started coming out of their homes looking confused and worried. The paramedics came quickly and worked on Liz, but it was clear that things were very bad. Later, I found out that she had passed away at the hospital. She was only 29 years old, and I never thought something so awful could happen in our neighborhood. The police said Liz had been shot at close range by someone who walked up to her. A neighbor's security camera caught part of it, and the video showed a person getting out of a black Nissan Frontier, walking up to Liz, shooting her, and driving away, and it all happened in seconds. Liz and her husband Sergio were loved by everyone. They were high school sweethearts and had been married for about 4 years. They loved Star Wars and Harry Potter and went to conventions together. And the garage sale Liz was having that morning was to help pay for a trip to Universal Studios to celebrate their 5th anniversary. And knowing this made her death even sadder. After Liz died, the neighborhood changed drastically. People were sad and scared, and we kept wondering who could have done this. Was it someone she knew? Was it random? The police talked to neighbors and looked at security videos, but they didn't find any answers. They released the video of the suspect in the truck, hoping someone would recognize them, and nobody did. I kept thinking about that morning. Could I have done something to help? Could I have seen more, remembered a license plate? And that guilt stuck with me. I would sit and stare at Liz's house, hoping to see her again, even though I knew that I wouldn't. The empty driveway was a painful reminder of what had happened, and Sergio moved out a few months later, totally understandable. It must have been too hard for him to stay in the house with all of those memories, and that house was sold and new people moved in. They're nice, but to me it will always be Liz's home. And years have passed, but the case is still unsolved. Sometimes the news will run a story about Liz, hoping to keep her memory alive, and the reward for information has grown, but no one has come forward. And it makes me so angry to know the person who did this is still free out there. I joined a local group that helps with unsolved cases. We hold events, hand out flyers, and try to keep cases like Liz's in the public eye. It's not much, but it feels like I'm doing something. Liz and her family deserve justice. Every year on the anniversary of her death, I leave yellow roses at her driveway, as yellow was her favorite color. Other neighbors do the same, and it's a quiet way to show that we haven't forgotten her. Sometimes at night, I look out my window and wonder if the answer is closer than we think. Did someone see something that they're too scared to tell? Could the killer be nearby? Not knowing has become very hard. Liz's death taught me that life is fragile, that bad things don't always make sense. But it also showed me how people can come together during very tough times. Our neighborhood has changed, and we're more careful to look out for each other even more now. We value small moments like that. I miss Liz. I miss her smile and kindness, and I carry her memory with me and will keep trying to get justice for her. Someone has to. She deserves it. I had decided to go to some yard sales in the neighborhood, and I wasn't looking for anything specific, just seeing if there was anything interesting. After visiting a few, I was about to go home when I saw an old metal box under a table at one of the sales. I asked the lady in charge of the sale how much she wanted for the box, and she said the box belonged to her uncle and she had no idea what was inside. Then, after thinking for a moment, she said that she wanted $5 for it. I gave her the money and carried the box to my car. As I held it, I thought that I felt a slight vibration or sort of hum, but I wasn't sure. I figured it was just my imagination and then drove home, eager to see what was inside. When I opened the box in my kitchen, I saw a small metal ball. It was warm when I touched it. The air felt heavy around it too, and it had a symbol on it that I didn't recognize. Below the ball were some old papers. They were yellowed and had strange equations and diagrams on them. Since I didn't understand any of them, I thought that it might be a good idea to ask someone online about it. I took a picture of the glowing ball and posted it on a forum asking if anyone knew what it was, and I got a lot of replies. Most people joked about it being from aliens or a movie prop, but one comment stood out to me. It said, "Get rid of it. It's radioactive." I felt my stomach drop. I moved away from the box, feeling nervous, and I didn't know what to do next. Should I call someone? But who? Then I got a private message in my inbox. It was from someone who said that they worked in nuclear safety, and the message said, "Don't touch it anymore. Move it to a safe place and let me help you." And I followed their instructions to the letter. I took the box to my garage and put it inside a plastic container, and I stayed as far away from it as I could while moving it. The person messaged me again asking for more details, and they wanted to know the size of the ball, its color, and about the papers. And they explained that warm metal objects can sometimes be radioactive, especially if they're old lab samples or industrial materials, and the person then told me to call the authorities. I was scared, but knew that they were right, and I called the police. They transferred me to a state agency that handles dangerous materials. And about an hour later, a team arrived at my house wearing protective suits and carrying special equipment. The team scanned the ball with a device that made clicking noises, and the clicks got faster the closer they got to the ball. They told me it was radioactive. One of them said that I was lucky that I hadn't kept it in the house for long because it could have possibly made me very sick. And they carefully packed the ball and the papers into a special container that was lined with lead, and then took it away. Later, I found out the police questioned the woman who sold me the box. She said that she had no idea her uncle had anything dangerous. She explained that he had been a chemist many years ago. The radioactive ball was probably something that he had worked on and forgotten about. And the authorities told me that they would investigate further, but I never heard anything else about it. Now, for weeks after this happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That glowing ball could have caused serious harm, and at first it seemed like a fun mystery, but it turned out to be very dangerous. I thought about how close I had come to putting myself and others at risk just because I was curious. And I haven't gone to any yard sales since that day. The whole experience has made me very nervous about bringing unknown things into my home. And now, whenever I see an interesting object for sale, I think twice. There was a woman in my neighborhood running a yard sale. She was selling some old furniture, clothes, and knickknacks. A few neighbors had stopped by to look around. Her small dog was tied up to a post nearby. That small dog was barking every so often. And down the street there was a larger dog that lived with his owner. And he was a big dog, a mix of some kind, and his owner usually kept him in the backyard or on a leash when they went for walks. But this morning, something went wrong. The gate to the big dog owner's backyard had been left open, and that big dog saw his chance and ran out into the street. At first, that big dog was just exploring. He sniffed around and ran back and forth, and then he noticed the people and the tables up ahead. His tail wagged as he ran toward the closest yard sale, but as he got closer, his energy shifted, and his bark grew louder and more aggressive. His eyes locked on the crowd, and he charged forward. People saw the big dog coming and started to back away, and a little boy dropped the toy that he was holding and screamed as he ran to his mom, but the big dog didn't stop. He jumped onto a table, knocking over a stack of books and smashing a bunch of glass. The lady looked up and shouted, "Get away," but that dog didn't listen. He grabbed a stuffed animal from the table and started tearing it apart. Then the big dog turned his attention to the little dog, and the little dog was barking, the big dog barked back, and then it attacked. The lady screamed and grabbed the little dog just in time, and the big one circled her. She began yelling for help, and the crowd began to scatter. A man who had been browsing a table nearby tried to intervene, yelling and stepping in front of the lady and her dog, and that big dog then attacked the man. The dog sunk his teeth into the man's leg. He yells out in pain and tried to push the dog away, but the dog wouldn't let go. The man fell to the ground trying to kick the big dog, but the dog's strength was too much. People were screaming. One man threw a folding chair at that dog and did nothing. The dog let go of the man's leg and jumped on its chest. The man used his arms to shield his face, and the dog scratched him as he yelled for help. That dog's owner came running down the street shouting at the dog to stop, and it did, and its owner then clipped the leash onto its collar. That bigger dog's owner said that he was sorry. Someone at that point had already called the cops, and someone else began to yell at that dog owner. Paramedics arrived and began treating the man's injuries before loading him into an ambulance, and neighbors stood around talking to one another. The dog's owner apologized again. The yard was a mess with broken glass and scattered items everywhere. Some people helped the lady clean up, and the street was quiet again. All I know, as a bystander who just sat and watched everything unfold, is that myself nor anyone in the neighborhood will ever forget that day. It was a cold weekend morning when I was walking through the neighborhood with a cup of coffee in my hand, and I noticed a yard sale at this old house. It wasn't much, just a folding table and a few blankets spread out on the grass, but something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the idea that someone's old stuff might actually hold a hidden gem. An elderly man sat behind the table, and he looked tired but still had a smile on his face. He asked if I was looking for anything in particular, and I shook my head and said no, just sort of scanning through the items. There were old books, porcelain figurines, some vintage lamps, and a box of very tarnished silverware. I picked up an old hardcover book with a faded green cover. As I flipped through its pages, the man spoke again, and he said the book had stories in it, some of them supposedly true. He added that he never could finish it himself because it was actually too spooky. And I just sort of laughed and was about to ask how much he wanted for it when I heard a truck pull up. A black pickup truck stopped and 4 teenagers climbed out. One of them sort of sneered, kicking a garden gnome that was sitting by the sidewalk, and the gnome fell over and actually broke into pieces. At that moment, the elderly man's smile faded. He asked those teenagers to move along if they weren't interested in buying anything. One skinny kid with dark hair and a cruel grin picked up one of the porcelain figures, asked how much it was, and the man told him something like $5 to $10. The teenager just laughed and threw the figurine to the ground, shattering it into pieces. The man asked him not to do that, and he explained that the figurine belonged to his late wife and asked them to have some respect. The skinny kid just grinned again. He shoved the old man's chest, making him stumble back. I wanted to say something, but it was all just too surreal, and I genuinely was too scared, I'm embarrassed to say. The old man tried to stand his ground. He said he'd call the police and pulled out his phone. That skinny kid grabbed the phone and threw it into the street, and then before anyone could react, he punched the old man, who then fell to the ground. That gang of teens started kicking and hitting him, and the rest of us just stood there, frozen. And all I could do was hold onto that book and watch. Finally, after what felt like a very long time, I heard a siren in the distance. Someone must have called the cops, and those teenagers took off in their truck. The old man lay on the ground. He was bleeding, and a few people slowly went over to help him up. I just stayed where I was, feeling very ashamed. and when the police arrived, they took statements. I handed the book back to the old man who was sitting on the porch with an ice pack on his swollen face, and he told me just to keep it. That night, I dreamed of that yard sale. This time, the teenagers weren't just breaking things, they were breaking me. And the old man just stood there, smiling, letting it all play out. The picturesque town of Dyersburg, Tennessee, nestled along the Mississippi River, is the kind of place where neighbors know each other and life is quiet. But in 2015, the town became the focus of national attention due to the mysterious disappearance and subsequent murder of Karen Swift, a 44-year-old mother of 4. What began as a seemingly ordinary day with a yard sale ended in tragedy, leaving behind a puzzle that remains unsolved to this day. On October 30th, 2015, Karen Swift spent her Saturday hosting a yard sale at her home. A devoted mother, she was known for her vivacious personality and active involvement in the community. The yard sale drew numerous visitors throughout the day as Karen cheerfully interacted with buyers, many of whom were neighbors and acquaintances. For Karen, it was an opportunity to declutter her home and connect with others in her close-knit community. That evening, Karen attended a Halloween party with friends. She returned home late and spoke briefly with her estranged husband, David Swift, who still lived in the family home despite their ongoing divorce proceedings. According to reports, the two had a cordial but strained relationship, sharing the residence to co-parent their children. In the early hours of October 31st, Karen went missing. When Karen's friends and family realized that she had vanished, alarm bells went off. Her car, a white 2004 Nissan Murano, was found abandoned on a rural road just a few miles from her home. The vehicle's tires were flat, and her belongings, including her purse and phone, were left inside. However, there was no sign of Karen herself. Dyer County authorities immediately launched a search. Friends, family, and volunteers combed through nearby wooded areas, fields, and waterways, hoping to find any trace of Karen. Her disappearance struck fear into the hearts of the community, as speculations swirled about what might have happened. Was she abducted by someone that she met at the yard sale? Was her estranged husband involved, or was it the work of a stranger? The case took a devastating turn on December 10, 2015, when Karen's decomposed body was discovered in a wooded area near a cemetery, less than 3 miles from her home. Her remains were concealed under foliage, and the area appeared to have been deliberately chosen to hide her body. An autopsy revealed that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The discovery confirmed what many had feared. Karen Swift had been murdered. However, the identity of her killer remained a mystery, and the investigation into her death became more complex as authorities sifted through a growing list of suspects. Karen's life was undergoing significant changes at the time of her death. She had recently filed for divorce from David Swift, citing irreconcilable differences. Friends described the marriage as troubled, with Karen seeking a fresh start. The divorce proceedings, however, were contentious, and David's behavior came under scrutiny following Karen's disappearance. In addition to her marital struggles, Karen had been involved in local fitness groups and was active on social media. Her outgoing personality and wide circle of acquaintances led investigators to explore whether someone she knew could have harbored ill intentions. One of the more intriguing aspects of the case was the yard sale Karen hosted on the day before her disappearance. A yard sale is a public event attracting strangers to a private residence. Investigators considered the possibility that Karen's killer might have been someone who attended the sale and used it as an opportunity to target her. However, no concrete evidence linked any of the yard sale attendees to the murder. As the investigation progressed, David Swift became a person of interest. Though he publicly denied any involvement, his strained relationship with Karen and his presence at the family home on the night of her disappearance drew suspicion. Friends of Karen claimed that she expressed fear of David in the weeks leading up to her death, and there were rumors of past domestic disputes. And despite these allegations, authorities did not charge David Swift with any crime. He cooperated with the investigation and maintained his innocence, but the cloud of suspicion continued to hang over him. Other theories emerged as well. Some speculated that Karen's killer could have been a stranger who abducted her after her car broke down. Others suggested that she might have been the victim of someone she had met through her social circles or online activity. However, none of those theories produced definitive leads. As months turned into years, the investigation into Karen Swift's murder stalled. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and private investigators, no arrests were made and no new evidence came to light. The lack of witnesses and forensic evidence left the case at a standstill, frustrating Karen's family and friends. The community of Dyersburg remained haunted by Karen's death. Her children, left without their mother, faced the difficult task of moving forward while grappling with unanswered questions surrounding her murder. Karen's friends continued to advocate for justice, organizing memorials and raising awareness about her case in the hopes of keeping it in the public eye. Several key questions remain unanswered. Who killed Karen Swift? Was it someone she knew or a random attacker? Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect or motive. The flat tires on Karen's vehicle suggest that she may have been forced to stop, but it's unclear whether this was staged or coincidental. While there is no evidence tying the yard sale to her murder, the timing raises questions about whether someone who attended the sale might have returned later. And despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, the case remains unsolved, leading to frustration and speculation about investigative missteps or lack of resources. Karen Swift's murder remains one of the most perplexing and tragic cases in Tennessee's recent history. Her family continues to seek answers, holding out hope that new evidence will emerge or that someone with knowledge of the crime will come forward. In the meantime, her case serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly life can change and the enduring pain of unanswered questions. For the residents of Dyersburg, the loss of Karen Swift is a scar that is yet to heal. Her vibrant spirit and love for her children are remembered, even as the search for her killer continues. In 2018, the quiet neighborhoods of Fort Worth, Texas became the hunting grounds for a predator. What should have been ordinary friendly interactions during community garage sales turned into a nightmare as a series of crimes struck fear into unsuspecting homeowners. The media soon dubbed the criminal the Texas Garage Sale Stalker, a name that sent shivers down the spines of those hosting and attending these everyday events. Garage sales are a cherished tradition in many American neighborhoods, and Fort Worth was no exception. Families use these sales to declutter their homes and make extra cash while fostering a sense of community. It was a safe, casual environment where strangers could peruse items and neighbors could connect over shared stories. But in 2018, these gatherings became a fertile ground for a monster, someone who saw the sales not as an opportunity to bargain, but as a chance to prey on the vulnerable. The terror began in March when a woman hosting a garage sale noticed a man lingering longer than most customers. He asked innocuous questions about a piece of furniture but seemed more interested in observing her movements and the layout of her home. Later that evening, as she was packing up unsold items, the man returned, only this time he was armed. He demanded cash and valuables, forcing his way into her home. Though she survived the encounter physically unharmed, she was deeply shaken. The man escaped before police arrived, who chalked it up to a one-off robbery. However, within weeks, similar incidents began cropping up in nearby neighborhoods. By late spring, a clear pattern had emerged. The attacker targeted women hosting garage sales alone or with minimal help. He struck near the end of the sales, when most items were packed away and neighbors had dispersed. Victims described him as a middle-aged man with an average build, wearing unremarkable clothing, a face that would easily blend into a crowd. The attacker used different methods to enter homes. Sometimes he pretended to inquire about items, other times he forced his way inside. Once in, he demanded money and occasionally ransacked the home for valuables, though the robberies didn't always involve physical violence. The psychological toll was immense. Victims were left traumatized, fearing for their safety and the sanctity of their homes. The media caught wind of the crimes by early summer. Headlines warned homeowners to stay vigilant during garage sales, and community forums were flooded with accounts of strange encounters. Residents shared tips on staying safe, such as doing garage sales in pairs or groups and not allowing customers inside their homes for any reason. Despite these precautions, the attacker continued to strike. Police advised the public to report suspicious behavior, but identifying the stalker proved difficult. He avoided security cameras and chose neighborhoods with limited surveillance. His nondescript appearance and tendency to leave quickly made it hard for witnesses to provide detailed descriptions. In July, one victim's quick thinking nearly led to the attacker's capture. A woman hosting a garage sale noticed a man fitting the stalker's description loitering near her driveway. She became suspicious when he lingered without showing much interest in her items. She discreetly alerted a neighbor, who began taking photos of the man from across the street. Sensing he had been spotted, the man left abruptly, abandoning any plans he might have had to strike. The neighbor shared the photos with police, but they were grainy and insufficient for identification, and still the encounter marked a very strong turning point. The community became determined to stop the stalker, and the stalker's reign of terror came to a head in late August. A woman hosting a garage sale on the outskirts of Fort Worth was attacked after her event ended. This time, the encounter escalated to violence. The attacker struck her with the butt of his gun, leaving her unconscious before fleeing with cash and jewelry. She was found by a neighbor who had heard the commotion and called 911. The brutality of this attack intensified the urgency of the investigation. Police increased patrols in neighborhoods where garage sales were common and set up decoy sales in an attempt to lure the stalker. The community's vigilance also grew, with many canceling their sales altogether or moving them to safer, centralized locations. The breakthrough came in September, when the stalker grew careless. He attempted to rob a garage sale in a neighborhood that had formed a community watch group. Unbeknownst to him, several members were observing the sale from nearby cars, ready to intervene if anything seemed amiss. When he approached the homeowner aggressively, the group sprang into action, blocking his escape route and calling the police. The man tried to flee on foot but was quickly apprehended. He was identified as Mark Eldridge, a 43-year-old drifter with a history of petty theft and burglary. Eldridge had no fixed address, which explained his ability to move undetected between neighborhoods. Police found stolen items in his vehicle, linking him to several of the robberies. Eldridge's arrest brought a sense of relief to Fort Worth, but the scars he left behind were lasting. Many victims struggled with anxiety and fear, and the community's sense of safety was deeply shaken. Garage sales, once a simple and enjoyable tradition, became a reminder of vulnerability. During his trial, Eldridge showed little remorse. He was convicted on multiple accounts of robbery, assault, and burglary and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Prosecutors described him as a predator who exploited trust and community spirit for his own gain. The Texas garage sale stalker case highlighted the dangers of seemingly innocent events and the importance of vigilance. Residents of Fort Worth took the lessons to heart, implementing safety measures to protect themselves in the future. These included hosting sales in groups, using visible security cameras, and maintaining constant communication with neighbors. Though the ordeal was traumatic, it also brought the community closer together. Neighbors who had been strangers banded together to support one another, ensuring that no one faced the threat alone. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.